And now from the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C., a panel on writing biographies with Christopher Hitchens on Thomas Jefferson, Francine Prose on Caravaggio, and Michael Korda on Ulysses S. Grant. This is an hour, 15 minutes.
My name is Carol Bogash. I am Director of Educational and Cultural Programs for the Smithsonian Associates, and I'm delighted that you're here this evening at the Smithsonian Castle, sitting in the library, which seems like a perfect place for this program. We are here to celebrate and enjoy the art of biography. This evening highlights the first in a new series by HarperCollins Publishers titled Eminent Lives, in which a number of distinguished authors will publish biographies of well-known figures central to history and culture. I want to thank all of you who are members of the Resident Associate Program for your membership and for coming out for programs like this one tonight. And for all of those who are not members of this Resident Associate Program, we hope that you'll join us. To discuss the art of biography tonight, we are delighted to have Christopher Hitchens, Francine Prose, and Michael Korda as our guests. Their discussion is moderated by Mark Pachter, the director of the National Portrait Gallery and editor of Telling Lives, The Biographer's Art. Christopher Hitchens is the author of more than 10 books, including recently A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. He contributes a monthly essay on books to the Atlantic Monthly, which I go to first when my magazine arrives, and is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair. He is also the author of the forthcoming biography of Thomas Jefferson. Can't wait for that. Francine Prose is the author of a dozen novels, among them Bigfoot Dreams and Household Saints. Her most recent work was The Lives of the Muses, 9 Women and the Artists They Inspired, in addition to a new novel to be published in March titled A Changed Man. Her forthcoming biography for the Eminent Lives series is on Caravaggio. Can't wait for that either. Michael Korda is a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, including Another Life, a memoir of other people, Charmed Lives, and The Immortals. He is also editor-in-chief and corporate vice president of Simon & Schuster. His book for the Eminent Lives series is Ulysses S. Grant, which is available for sale and signing this evening. So I can't wait to get that. This series on Eminent Lives is edited by James Atlas. Mr. Atlas was a staff writer for Time and assistant editor for the New York Times Book Review and the New York Times Magazine, as well as contributing editor to The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair. Mr. Atlas is the founder of Atlas Books and the author of several biographies, including Delmore Schwartz, The Life of an American Poet, and Bellow, a biography. We have a stellar group of speakers for you this evening. So we're delighted that you could be here and that they're here. And would you please join me in giving a warm Smithsonian welcome to James Atlas.
I'm actually very distracted by these pandas over here. I don't know how many of you can see them chewing and running around, but I hope they're not a reproach to our talks tonight. I'm very glad to have this team of biographers here. I like to think of them as my team. I'm sure better behaved than the Pistons and the Pacers. And I'm sometimes asked how I got the idea of publishing a series of short biographies. This is the sequel to the Penguin Lives that I founded a few years ago. And I don't want to be in a succession of speakers here, but very briefly, I was on page 1,000 of my own biography of Saul Bellow, which had grown as tall as my children, developing at the same rate. And when I got to page 1,000, which I laminated and gave to my editor at Random House, as a present. She looked rather alarmed, and I thought there must be some other way to do this. So at that moment, the idea flew into my head that there should be short books by distinguished writers, a tradition that's long flourished in English and American letters, from Aubrey's brief lives through Johnson's lives of the poets and Lytton Strachey in many different forms. So what we have here in these brief lives is really a revival of a venerable form done by very lively and distinguished writers who are not specialists in their field. That's what's, I think, the dynamic that's so exciting about it, to have novelists, journalists, historians writing about biography. As a practicing biographer for the last 30 years, you can imagine I have a very long shelf of biographies myself and books about biography, more than a 5-foot shelf. And 3 of them that are the most prominent that I refer to time and again are Leon Edell's Essays on Literary Biography, Richard Ellman's Golden Codgers. I had the great good fortune to be a student of Ellman's at Oxford, which I'm sure set me on my own path, and Mark Pachter's Telling Lives. Mark has been at the Smithsonian, he tells me, for as long as I've been preoccupied with biography. I don't know if I should say how long that is, but 30 years. And he's the director of the National Portrait Gallery and an old friend of the biographer's art. Telling Lives is a terrific book that features 7 writers thinking about biography, writing about biography. It came out in 1979 and includes Doris Kearns and Justin Kaplan and Jeffrey Wolf. But I also am a great fan of Mark's introduction, in which he really crystallizes in just 12 or 13 pages what it means to write a biography. And he really understands all the elements of it, the biographer's ambivalence towards his subject, the way he becomes obsessed with his pursuit, the struggle to maintain a balance between narrative and interpretation. It's all there, and I can always tell from his citations that he's read as deeply as anyone has in the field. I can always crib from his introduction to find the quote from Plutarch and Boswell and Johnson that I need. It was interesting, when I pulled the volume down from the shelf this morning to look at it again, I was looking at the title and it said, Telling Lives. And it reminded me of something that W.H. Auden once said, that only an S separates the word cosmic from the word comic. So I looked at this and I thought, well, actually only a V separates telling lives from telling lies. And I can assure you that Mark is on the right side. If you have any doubt, I'll read you a sentence from his introduction. His search for the truth in a life is the biographer's preeminent standard, and his own response to that truth shapes his art. And I think that's as good a credo as any. So when I learned that Mark would be presiding over this evening, I knew that we were all in good hands, and I'm glad to welcome Mark Pachter. Thanks very much.
Well, put that way, I'm a hard act to follow, so I won't say very much because we really want to get to the proceedings tonight. I suppose I might say only one thing, and it's really about the National Portrait Gallery. Those of you who don't know it, and we've been closed in our building in Washington for a number of years now. We reopened in July 4th, 06. You might think, well, what is an art historian doing fascinated by biography? And I would simply say this to situate myself in this inquiry, that the National Portrait Gallery is not principally about portraiture understood as a visual art. It is a national institution of biography. It is really a place of portrayal. And so when I got there, initially, I immediately wanted to establish that fact in a broader sense by having the discussions which led to Telling Lives. And of course, the pun was intentional, the possible pun, when I did that, because I wanted people to understand biographers as portrayers or portraitists. And I find, and it's my segue into the evening where I will invite the panelists to come up, that a lot of the language to describe modern biography is borrowed from portraiture when it wants to be succinct and artful. And that certainly is the match we're looking for. Words like a profile. Sometimes biographers actually say they are doing a portrait of an individual. And every time that happens, you have the sense that the notion of just the heap of fact that might be biography, and was it heavily in the 19th century, becomes sculpted into a particular life told by a particular voice. And that's really, I think, the kind of biography that James Atlas is inviting us to enjoy through this remarkable series. That being said, I would like to invite the panelists to come up here, and as you seat, so shall you begin. What I have set as the rhythm of the evening, if I hope this suits all of you, is an opportunity to see a number of things. One, I think we want our own individual glimpse in the words of the biographers of the, perhaps it's the marriage they struck with the subject in this series, or their approach to biography. So I've asked them to each speak for about 5 minutes on that match that they've made. Then after that, I will ask a number of questions to invite conversation, and we will certainly leave some time at the end for your questions as well. So that will be the rhythm of the evening. That being said, Michael, would you like to give us your view?
I was a voracious reader of biography by the time I was 12. And living as I did in England and going to school in Switzerland, the American Civil War was not something that loomed large in my education. In England, we had our own Civil War a good many centuries before yours, and in Switzerland, so far as I know, there's never been one. But my father kept books everywhere and never cared what you read. He had no interest in preventing you from reading anything or encouraging. And I came across the works of Bruce Caplan, who is now somewhat disregarded as an American historian and thought to be too popular, and found myself plunging into the Civil War and came away from it with a tremendous and passionate fascination with the figure of Robert E. Lee. That is a fascination shared by more people than not. Lee is still an enormously iconic figure, an enormously admired figure. And it took me 2 or 3 years of reading into the Civil War before it occurred to me that Lee had been beaten by Grant. Also, that Lee, like Rommel, was a bad general, or good general rather, in a bad cause, because no matter how you cut it, the cause was rebellion and slavery and disunion. Whereas Grant was a good general in a good cause. And so I got interested, more and more interested, in Grant, whose awkwardness, whose shyness, whose ferocity in battle, whose skill at handling large numbers of men, seemed to me extraordinary, and also seemed to me to have received not sufficient respect. When the great presidents are toted up, there's always a column in magazines for the bad presidents, and Grant always appears either below or above Harding. I did not feel he belonged there. And early in coming to grips with the question of who Grant, this elusive and shy figure, who is, by any standards, the greatest general America has ever produced, and by any rational standards, a significant, important, and excellent president. Grant himself defined what made me write his life in his own writing, for he is also of all presidents, and certainly of all generals, the best writer. And his book is one of the few nonfiction books that is a piece and a part of American literature. He wrote, "I read but few lives of great men, because biographers do not, as a rule, tell us enough about the formative period of life. What I want to know is what a man did as a boy." And I decided that's what I want to know about Grant. I wanted to know the boy who became the victor of Shiloh, the victor of Fort Donelson. I wanted to know the Grant who acquired a reputation as a drunk, but still became a successful general and a president. I wanted to know who that boy was and to show readers who he was and how he became what he became. And that, I think, is, if not the art of biography, at any rate the thing that pushes most of us into writing them.
Well, we will perhaps come back to that subject as broadly, but before we go on, and I'm in effect asking this of each of you, it never occurred to me to ask before we began. In this particular series, were you invited into the series and asked to choose a life, or did the editor, it may have been the great Mr. Atlas himself, did he say to you, "I've always been interested in Corda on"? So was it your choice to pick Grant, or were you given an idea?
I must confess that Jim Atlas's charm and power of persuasion is such that I cannot remember the exact sequence of events that led to it. He had asked me to write a biography, and I had proposed a number of people who interested me, but did not seem to have the right kind of eminence for him. And after a couple of tries, I had wanted to do Ike.
A lesser general.
No, I would put him almost as an equal of Grant's. I had been tempted to do a biography of Hitler because I don't think there is a good short one. Fortunately for me, Jim talked me out of that, and I proposed Grant, which he loved. And I'm very happy because I loved the year or more that I spent with Grant, and I would have hated the year or more that I would have had to have spent with Hitler.
I think that's interesting to know. Francine, how did you come to this project?
Well, I came to it first really through Caravaggio's work. There was a great Caravaggio show in New York in 1985 at the Met. And I remember going to it. I mean, I'd seen Caravaggio's paintings in reproduction before, but there's practically no one who reproduces so badly as Caravaggio. I saw the show, and he became really one of the most important painters to me. So when I would travel, I would make sure that I would find the museums that had Caravaggios and go to them. And I began to notice a thing that interested me, which is that even in museums that were underpopulated and empty, there'd be a huge crowd in front of the Caravaggio painting. There was always a big crowd. And then things began to happen. For example, I went to Rome a couple of years ago. I was just beginning to think about doing Caravaggio. And we arrived there very early in the morning. We had jet lag. We didn't feel like going to sleep. So we went down. We were staying up on the Janiculum, and we went down to look at the great Caravaggios in the Church of San Luigi Francesi. And I noticed a guy there who I'd seen on the plane. And he'd been on the same plane with us. He'd come over at the same time. And he had come straight off the plane as we had to see the Caravaggios. And I thought, no, he must be an artist or an art critic. And I said, what are you doing? What do you do? And he said, well, I'm an accountant for Mayor Bloomberg's office, right? But he had that same passion. And in the course of working on the book, I found all sorts of people in unexpected walks of life that had that feeling for Caravaggio. I knew a few things about Caravaggio's life, and I mean, I'm a novelist, really. I'm not a biographer. I knew that his life was a novelist's dream. It was I started thinking about it when it was still the Brief Lives series, and his was a really brief life. He lived to be 39. His life was extremely dramatic. He was accused and probably committed a murder. He was on the run from the police and various other groups of people for the last 4 years of his life. And he was the original bad boy Renaissance artist. So between the love for the work and the drama of the life, it seemed like a natural project.
And Mr. Atlas saw that immediately when you proposed it?
Well, Mr. Atlas and I have known each other for about 30 years now. So we would see each other, we would see each other at parties and so forth and talk about the possibility of my doing something. And I knew that I wanted to do a visual artist. I'd begun writing art criticism for the Wall Street Journal. So I wanted to write about paintings. And we talked about a few artists, and then I guess I came up with Caravaggio, and I ran into Jim, and he said, oh, just that day, someone had been in a meeting saying we should get someone to do Caravaggio, so that's how it worked out.
Fate, clearly. Christopher?
I've just realized it's a Hogwarts dining room that we're in. I knew it would come to me in a second. with pandas, and hard by Jefferson Street? No, this one here is Jefferson Way, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. There are now, I realize, there are three roads or streets in Washington, D.C. named for Jefferson. I think he's the only one of whom that can be said, and it's probably just as well because I now know there were at least three of him. But it's telling that there should be as many as that. I was always rather resistant to the idea of biography. I had done a couple of Strachey type debunkings of people I thought were overrated. But you're not really doing your job as a cultural critic in a celebrity culture if you don't do some of that Strachey type work. There are so many great tethered blimps just waiting for your attention. But I hadn't wanted to push it any further. I think this came out of probably some residual Marxism on my part. It was the feeling that in the telling of history, the role of the great man or great woman, the individual, is overrated at the expense of discussion of ideas or forces. When I was educated in England, it was, at least for the early years of it, it was a pageant of monarchs. We periodized our history by reigns. I don't think we stopped periodizing by reigns actually until probably the 30s. Then suddenly, if you notice, history is no longer periodized that way.
We still do it by administration.
Sometimes by administration, but sometimes by decades as well. America, I think, probably contributes a great deal to that form of periodization. At any rate, these were the resistances I had to overcome, and then maybe possibly some false modesty too. In other words, it seemed solipsistic to be writing in this way, and I didn't envy the life of people like Michael Holroyd for the opposite reason. It seemed to be too self-effacing. You were associated only with someone else's life. What are you going to do to have one of your own if you have to live the life of your subject all the time? So that was my frame and state of mind when Mr. Atlas, Louis Mem, approached me and said, would I like to do Margaret Thatcher? And I said yes. It did intrigue me as an idea. And I don't know how he knew this, but a few weeks later he called and said, you know, I don't think you're really happy with that, are you? And I realized I hadn't been thinking about it in the bath exactly, or in the shower, which is the unfailingly good sign for me when I have my first cigarette under the shower in the morning, to see if I'm still concentrating or not. And I said, no, as a matter of fact, no. And the only other time I'd ever been asked to consider a biography was by an agent who I think thought biography would give me a position in society of some kind, and had proposed Albert Einstein. And I knew at the first shower that was wrong, because Hitchens on Einstein, it just doesn't compute. And if I thought it was ridiculous, I was fairly sure everybody else would. So then he said, well, what about Jefferson? And I realized in that instant that not only had I always wanted to write about Thomas Jefferson, but that a lot of the time I was doing so in any case, because anyone who makes America their subject is in a sense condemned. Maybe that's too bleak a word, but is at any rate destined to write or think about Thomas Jefferson part of the time. And all political conversation, to some extent, involves him. And while I live in a city that's partly his memorial, I've lived here for nearly a quarter of a century. I now know we have the same birthday, though he was born under the old calendar, had to change his birthday during the course of his life. We share it with Seamus Heaney and Orlando Letelier, among others. And then I realized that James had wanted this terse biography, and I thought how wonderful that would be. I forget of what book it is that Dr. Johnson says no man could possibly wish it longer. It may be Gibbon. But that with Jefferson, I wished he'd asked me to take a little more space. And in fact, I even asked him if I might go to the upper limit and perhaps a fraction beyond, for this reason. Jefferson is in power more or less continuously once he goes to be minister in Paris, for 25 years, very nearly a solid quarter of a century at the top of the political tree. And that is after he has written the Declaration of Independence and been the governor of Virginia and composed the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. So it's an extraordinary life in every way, and it's a very, very massive one. And he kept an enormous correspondence going, and he wrote a number of journals and memoirs. And I don't think now it would be possible for any one person to say that they had read everything by him and about him. I think it might be beyond the compass of an individual to have done that. But it's worth a try, and it's a huge education in what is already the great subject. That's the United States. I know I've spoken fractionally too long already, but I'll trespass a little more if I may. The project of the Enlightenment, which was part of his design and part of his declaration, was what influenced him the most. Comes out all the time, not just in the substituting happiness for property in the Declaration, but also in the paradoxes of his attitude to his own property, and in his wanting to be remembered only. He designed, as you may know, his own memorial, and it's the one that is at Charlottesville, and he wanted to be remembered only for the authorship of the Declaration, the authorship of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, and the founding of the University of Virginia. That's all he wanted.
Right, never mentioned
to be president twice, and vice president, and secretary of state, and governor, and minister wasn't, he thought, that much worthy of notice. And even when he designed the Lewis and Clark expedition, and to some extent even the Louisiana Purchase, he was thinking of nation building, certainly, but he was thinking of building a new kind of nation that was based on a secular and scientific approach to life and to humanity. And one of the things that interests me most is his utter contempt for all forms of religious faith, which is a contempt that I personally share. And that's probably never been more germane than at the present. The idea of whether the United States is or is not a secular country. The other problem is too many forerunners. I mean, the Dumas Malone biography, which is the quarry from which the trucks still rumble away with chunks of stone and so on. In my book, I actually say, I wish I could do to it what Jefferson did to the Bible, namely take a razor blade and cut out all the superfluous junk and see what we're left with. The Malone book is in a way a disgrace, and someone needs to far outdo me and do a replay. Merrill Peterson's rivalry is worth mentioning, I think, here. Very good, shorter but solid book. And then, just because everybody asks about Sally, I've never met anyone and told them about the project who hasn't asked me about this. I should simply say that I do not see why there's ever been any controversy about this at all. I do not see how anyone could look at that evidence and be in the smallest doubt that Jefferson was the father of those children. Long before the DNA tests were made, long before even Annette Gordon-Reed's brilliant book, it's staring you in the face. And so it was fascinating for me to find that many people vastly senior to myself and much more qualified could have examined that evidence and either concluded that it didn't point in that way or that it was ambivalent. And so I've done a chapter just on that, as I felt I had to do. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but my subject just lived a lot longer.
And I think the point of being consumed by the subject is exactly appropriate. One thing on Jefferson, and then a general question, and that is that it's not only the name of the streets that are after Jefferson, but there are three, I think only, but particularly domes that are precisely meant to evoke Monticello. The Natural History Museum, in the old West Wing of the Art Museum, the National Gallery, and then actually, whether it was intentional or not, it speaks to the other two, the new National Museum of the American Indian. They're all, in effect, tributes to the Jeffersonian ideal.
He even has a form of democracy named after him, which doesn't happen to everybody.
Yes, indeed. Well, now the broader question, which takes off from each of your characterizations of your passion, I'll start with an anecdote which would add to this point, and that is that I had the interesting experience of being with David McCullough the day after he had told his publisher to take back the $1 million advance he had gotten to write Picasso. And he had tried hard for a year writing Picasso and decided he just couldn't do it. And I think it was a matter not of expertise in his point of view, although he was the first to admit he wasn't an expert on art. It was a matter of sympathy. And that brilliant publisher of his said, instead of accepting the $1 million back, whom would you like to write about? And he said Harry Truman. And that led to it. So the question I want to ask you is the question of sympathy. I think we felt some of it in your descriptions of your subjects, but have you found it necessary to feel sympathetic toward your subject? We have the straightgy notion of sort of taking your subject on, but have you found it important to have a feeling that this is a life that you can evoke and admire? Or is admiration not critical to your telling of the story?
I would first like to say that having been David McCullough's editor for 25 years or so, yes, that this is an anecdote that I can vouch for. I am the publisher.
Oh, it is true.
Yes.
Good, good. Well, congratulations.
And that leads me to say something which I feel, but which I've never properly analyzed. The art of biography would be limiting if we limited it only to those subjects whom we liked or felt we would be comfortable with. Hitler is a perfect example of somebody with whom most of us would certainly feel uncomfortable, but in many ways ought to be studied very carefully. And there's a deficiency, as a matter of fact, in the English language of really good biographies of Hitler, whereas a really good one would be a valuable and important book. So I think that we can't limit biography or think about biography as if it were a form of fan mail. I would have been very uncomfortable writing a biography of Lee, much as I admire him, because there's something remote and something altogether cold about Lee, a perfection of manner which seems off-putting, or at any rate, which seems off-putting to us at present, whereas I found with Grant that his very shabbiness and his bouts of drunkenness and his self-doubt and his awkwardness and his unhappy childhood made him a figure that I related to and could feel a great sympathy for. So I think that the biographer really has to decide whether you're going to be a full-time professional at it, in which case, as was the case with Harold Nicholson, when the call comes from Buckingham Palace to honor you with the task of writing the definitive official biography of George V, you say yes and accept the fact that it will be 5 years of work and you'll get a knighthood afterwards, and that's perfectly respectable. But for the amateur biographer, I feel that the task would be impossible if you didn't like your subject.
Francine, you spoke of a fascination with this life and certainly an admiration for the art, but not necessarily a sympathy.
Well, Caravaggio is the last guy you'd want to meet in a dark alley somewhere. I mean, he was a brawler. You know, he was in trouble with the law over 20 times during his life. He was a murderer, actually, but I found him incredibly appealing and romantic and attractive. I mean, for one thing, he was a genius, which is always attractive. For another, he himself was passionate about art. I mean, he left no writings, so we don't. In fact, there's very little information about his life. He didn't write a word that we know about, but there's one. There was a court case he was involved in. He was sued for libel by a fellow painter, and he was terrible to his fellow painters. I mean, critical and insulting. And there's the document of the court case in which he gives this incredibly beautiful, impassioned defense of real art, of art that's drawn from nature, of art that is not idealized. And you know, when I started learning about his life, I realized how near the end of his life, or just before the murder, actually, he had been an extremely successful and celebrated painter in Rome. And then the more sentimental, the more saccharine, the more acceptable artists began to be more popular, and he just went kind of crazy as a result. Well, all those things, how could I possibly not be sympathetic to this guy?
And that's important in your choice, you think, of a life to live with in this way.
I would have wanted to write about him had he been, you know, a mass murder. I mean, I don't think that would have affected my decision. The art still would have been the art, but I did find him hugely appealing.
Christopher, I want to ask the same question of you, but to say one thing. I once interviewed Duma Malone, who had spent those almost 50 years and 5 volumes of Jefferson. And I asked him a question that I would like to ask you, although his take was probably different from yours. I said, did Jefferson ever disappoint you? And he paused because his project was a project of monumental admiration. And he did give some instances when Jefferson disappointed him, but he was a bit taken aback. So I'm going to ask you, does this sort of soup of admiration apply to how you think about Jefferson? And if so, did he disappoint you?
Well, for me, it was above all necessary that he be the subject of a continuous argument. In other words, that he not be a figure on whom there's a general agreement, or ever will be. Because then I knew I would never get bored, so that I wouldn't feel the rattle of the revolver against my teeth in the morning, which is what you don't want when you're writing a book. And you're guaranteed that with Jefferson. But though, of course, you are, to some extent, you are writing counter to hagiographical portrayal. I mean, obviously, I shouldn't say of Malone that he's like, it's not Parson Weems exactly, but he clearly felt he had a responsibility for representing this part of American history in a respectable way, to borrow.
Well, there was that George V sort of concept.
In what I think I have to call a respectable way, and you mustn't upset the school children too much. There's certain things that, and I don't know which instances he gave, to come to your second part of your question. Well, before I do that, there's another thing. I think it's a jolly good thing if you're writing about somebody where there are no tapes, no photographs, nothing of this kind, where it's litera scripta manet, the written word will remain. And you have to go and look at the stuff, and it's all reading. There are some good portraits of him. It would, of course, be lovely to have a photograph, but no one really knows. And there are lots of areas of himself that he kept very private. I think Gore Vidal's description of him in Burr is very plausible, that he was a very passionate person, but very, very much under control, and with a splinter of ice somewhere in his core. And if you ask the question that I always ask about anyone I know, which was if they were an animal, what animal would they be? He would be a fairly large fox with a questing muzzle and a ruthless disposition and a good deal of cunning.
I think you admire foxes.
Not against. You can't eat them.
Understood.
Well, as to disappointment, therefore, I don't know what Malone's replies to you were. Perhaps
I'll
I'd be
tell
interested
you
in
briefly
finding out, by the way. But I mean, what I really have against Malone, it's in my book actually, is that at one point he said of the claims by the Hemmings' descendants that they had Jefferson's blood. He said, well, that's just what you'd expect. They're just trying to make themselves more pedigreed. He said, it's just like what some farmers and stock breeders do coming showtime or race time. They pretend preposterous lineages for their animals. Well, I thought that's a bit much as a comparison, for one thing. What did he think he was saying there? And for a second, it's rather the other way around in point of who owns whom, this bloodstock analogy. And I thought, gosh, but it seemed no one else cared about that. That was considered a respectable reply at the time. Well, there you go. I, of course, knew, as anyone who goes to the Jefferson Memorial can see, that a lot of editing of his stuff is required to make it incisable in lapidary form on that memorial, that nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Fate than that these people shall be free. You have to cut out a lot of what he elsewhere said. And of course everybody knew there was a paradox in his life. But I guess I was shocked to find out how much and how coldly he was determined not just to postpone the abolition of slavery, but to extend the time in which it would be an institution. I don't think I appreciated at all the extent to which that was true. And I think disappointment isn't quite the right word for that, is it? But it was an education anyway, to find that out.
Yes, no, it's very much to the point. Malone's disappointment was the extent to which, having read so many of his letters, how much, as Malone said, he massaged the truth.
Yes.
And then he went on to excuse that as a Southern disposition. But
Yeah.
It won't be about Malone.
Malone has an answer for everything. Actually, there is another big disappointment. Both Jefferson and his wife thought Tristram Shandy was a very funny book. So you were dealing with people who obviously had no sense of humor at all. They would sit around and read it to each other in the long evenings. So it's a real run-for-your-life image, I think, that.
Yeah, well, not a chuckle a minute.
No, no.
The next question is, again, I think perhaps inevitable in the series that we're contemplating, and that is the question of brevity as a virtue. I think James actually suggested, maybe I didn't hear it well, I was just basking in the glory of what he was saying about me, but I think he did suggest something about it being more comfortable to do a short life if you're not actually an expert on the life, which I think we would mean either as a professional biographer or not necessarily that, but somebody who wasn't immersed before in the life. But I wonder if that's the only issue in brevity. Strachey, who's the father of us all in terms of some of these aspirations, really felt that brevity was critical to the capturing of a life, and that he felt that anything else, those long volumes, was a kind of entombment, and that the life was only really presentable and evocable briefly. Now, that being said, that was Strachey, but Michael, what about the sort of the length of either time invested in the project and in the form itself? Do you think it suits?
But to answer it, you know, I wrote a biography of my father and his two brothers called Charmed Lives, which was a very long book. It's rather like W.C. Fields' comments, I've been rich and I've been poor, and believe me, rich is better. There's a pleasure to writing a long biography. You can play with the materials, you can put them in, you can deal with people's correspondence, you can sum up long lives, you have more room to play with, and that was for me a great experience. And if somebody had said to me, you couldn't write a biography of Grant, but it can't be less than, say, 700 manuscript pages, that would not have daunted me at all. In fact, I think I would have been somewhat energized by that and done it happily. I think it's in some ways more difficult to condense a life into a short form. And indeed, I think one of the challenges that Jim Atlas presents his authors with is not just to write about somebody who interests them, which is kind of a form of saying, put up or shut up. If you're that interested, do it, which is very smart. But the other is to say it must be of this particular small length, so that you have to condense. You have to get the whole story into a very small number of pages.
It's a biographical sonnet.
Yeah, I think that's a most interesting challenge. If you take Grant, for example, to me, if anything truly astonished me and pleased me, it was my ability, or so I fancy, to make Grant's campaigns and battles crystal clear to a non-military reader in a very short form and without maps. And if I had to sort of put my hand to anything and say, I'm amazed I could do that, that is the thing that amazes me the most. So I think it is a challenge. Certainly the bigger the life, the harder it is to get it into 160 book pages. But it's a fascinating challenge, and it's what makes writing these biographies such an acute pleasure, is that it's different from anything else we do as a writer. Other books, by and large, we go on and on and on and on until we feel we finally wrung the subject to death. You can't do that with a book this thick.
Running the subject to death is a rather nice description for biography, but
yes.
Francine, when Jim posed this not only as a topic, well, you had the topic, but as a length, was that daunting, or was that exactly what you had hoped for?
Well, I was in a very different situation than Michael and Christopher, because if I were to write down everything that was known and everything that was known for a fact about Caravaggio's life, the book would have been about 15 pages long. So then the question is, what else I wanted to put in the book besides Caravaggio's life? I mean, certain things seemed important to me. That is, what Rome was like during the time in which he lived, what the social and political climate during the different papacies was, and, you know, contemporary art history. I mean, there was a very, very good biography of Caravaggio published about 10 years ago by Helen Langdon, and in some ways, I didn't have much to add to that, but what I did have, so in a way being able to concentrate it and compress it was great for me. But also I knew that I wanted to be able to write about the paintings in a way that they hadn't been written about. So I could take everything about the life, a certain amount about the surrounding history, and then just write as much as I wanted about the paintings, which was ideal for me.
Christopher, does size matter?
Obviously, the hardest person of all would be William Shakespeare. So all books about him have to be Shakespeare and his time, or something of the sort, because we know practically nothing.
If I may put in, Bill Bryson's doing Shakespeare for us.
I remember thinking I took my rug off to Bryson. And at this length, too, because he's got to do it medium length. I mean, you could do it a little... Anyway, well, as I've said already, I shouldn't labor the point, but with my subject, quite large books, or series of books, have been written about just the Louisiana Purchase, or the Lewis and Clark expedition, or the Barbary War, as it's commonly called. Actually, very little known part of Jefferson's life, the decision to go to war with the Islamic tyrannies of North Africa. So I was spoiled for choice as far as all that went. What one tries to do, I think, is to find something that's vaguely thematic. In other words, well, here is the same story, but it's in a different form. The same things are operating on Jefferson when he's doing apparently quite discrepant policy. And so by doing that, you can fold it in a bit. I hope I've managed to do that. And then I can share a corny theme with you, if you like. Want to share? Well, the 4th of July is generally agreed to be the date of American independence. It probably isn't, but it's the one that they decided, they hit upon to agree on. That was the day of the Declaration. And it is also the day on which the Louisiana Purchase is announced in the public prints in Washington, which is also the day that Lewis and Clark say goodbye to their master and leave for Pittsburgh to set off for the West. And it's also the day on which Jefferson dies, on the same day as John Adams. So there are ways, again, of sort of hanging out a line and draping various things along it that give it some shape. And also, by the way, you're going to need this line because you have to have the thread of Ariadne in the labyrinth and something to follow and hold on to yourself.
The three themes, I'm really referring back to what Michael said about the childhood and the becoming the subject, becoming the individual, and how each of you balance these elements. It really also speaks to what Christopher just said. Once Edmund Morris said to me that who did not write a short biography, is still writing the biography of, he could, but he hasn't done. In fact, he thought originally it was just going to be a screenplay, as you know. But is he? Who is he?
Keep doing this.
Edmund Morris. Edmund Morris.
Whoever you can think of, Atlas has been there
Beethoven.
first. Yeah.
Well, Edmund Morris is a passionate pianist, so he would have loved that. But in the Theodore Roosevelt, basically he's given the arc broadly and then devoted a separate book, you know, the sweetness of youth, as he would put it, the rise of Theodore Roosevelt, the period of power, Theodore Rex, which we've seen, and then the one he really wants to write about, which is the decline. That's the Greek arc that he's interested in. In your books, have you weighted it toward any one of these periods in the life, childhood, period of sort of consummate achievement, and then decline? Caravaggio didn't have time for decline. But to start with Michael, is it really heavily weighted toward the young Grant?
I would say yes, but I would do the same for almost anybody. I think that without exploring in depth somebody's childhood, you're leaving out the most interesting part, and the part that enables the rest of the life to make sense. Once you know the child, then very often the adult person becomes much more knowable. The less you know about the child, the more in doubt you are about knowing the adult. With Grant, the childhood is of enormous interest and enormous importance, and I devoted probably more pages than I should have to it, partly because I wanted to write about what a childhood in Ohio and in Illinois was like in the 1820s and 1830s. I think it's extremely important in writing biography to bear in mind, which for some reason biographers have great difficulty in doing as a rule, that we are writing about people who aren't living today. Therefore, we first of all owe the reader to the recreation of their lives within the society and the kind of world in which they lived. We also owe them not judging people and events by the standards that apply today. Because if you're writing about somebody in the 1830s, you must write about them within the standards that applied in the 1830s, not in 2004. I would say with the bulk of Grant, nevertheless, has got to be, if you're writing a biography about him, his genius as a general. And the threads of life, of childhood, of early experience, of West Point, that in this singularly unpromising young man who had the lowest marks ever recorded in the history of West Point at that time, except in horsemanship, and was also the worst dressed and most slovenly dressed cadet in the history of West Point. To go back, knowing what we know now, and take out of it the threads that you see will one day produce this extraordinary ability to command men in battle and this enormous courage that Grant displayed himself as a soldier. That is a fascinating task. So yes, I think the answer is that you must, in writing biography, devote a substantial amount of text to the thing that the person is famous for and best at. It would just be self-indulgent to produce a book that was 3/4 childhood and only 1/4 accomplishment.
Some books are only that, though, but not your book.
Not if you're writing the whole life.
And also, I think I've sensed now one bond of sympathy. It's the horsemanship.
Yes.
That would be another connection between you and
yes,
Grant.
I have to admit that I am a horseman myself, and I love horses and always have. And that one of the things that has always attracted me to Grant was that at the age of 10 or 11, he was a self-taught horse whisperer, and people brought him farm horses from all over Ohio and Illinois that were intractable, that bolted, that kicked, that couldn't be ridden. And this 10 or 11-year-old boy, without knowing how he did it, could gentle them, whisper to them, and hand them back to their owners, cured. And if that isn't an attractive trait in a man who was later on to become a general, I don't know what is.
I think we discovered the real reason why you wrote that book. Francine, in the short life of Caravaggio, do you look at this as the sort of segments of growth? And
well, you know, I decided to begin the book with the end of Caravaggio's life, with the last 4 years of his life. The murder was committed in 1606, and in Rome, and he left Rome. He fled to the hills outside Rome. Then he fled from Rome to Naples. He was doing okay in Naples. He was getting commissions. He fled Naples for some unknown reason. He went to Malta. He became a Knight of Malta, which was very unusual. He got into trouble. He was imprisoned. He escaped from prison. He fled Malta. He went to Sicily. He went to Syracuse. He got a commission. He painted one of his most beautiful paintings. He fled Syracuse. He went to Messina. He was accused by a school teacher of looking oddly at some of the schoolboys at play. He fled, he hit the guy, he fled, and so forth and so on. Went back to Naples, died under mysterious circumstances going to Rome. The astonishing thing to me about that period in his life was that he continued to paint. He was never anywhere for more than a few months. He continued to get commissions, and he did so the most extraordinary, moving, gorgeous paintings of his career. So it seemed to me that those years concentrated everything that was most violent, turbulent, and mysterious about his life. So that's where I started, and then I moved back to the beginning from there.
And the arc of Jefferson's life as you...
Again, very long. He's more than 80. I mentioned the Parson Weems School of Sentimental Hagiography before. Most of those, which I think have their origins in myth and in religion, do stress, extraordinary things about the childhood, like George Washington and the cherry tree, which we know to be false, as is the story of Kim Jong-il's birth being attended by showers of bluebirds that spoke Korean, as is all the stuff that we're about to have to go through celebrating again next month, all bulls from beginning to end. And I'm very glad that there's almost none of that in Jefferson to be quarried from, as far as I can
just can't know it.
I mean, I haven't been as lucky perhaps in my subjects, but I mean, it's the bit in most biographies that I find most irritating. And in Jefferson's case, we know his own autobiography doesn't really mention his childhood at all. He says somewhere else, it's in a letter, his first memory is when his family was moving house and he was carried on a cushion by a slave whose name he knew, or later knew. He knew which slave it had been. A little boy lying on a cushion being carried, and of course his life ends on a deathbed surrounded by unpaid domestic labor. We know, but we don't know why he did not like his mother at all. And obviously that, for most biographers, would be something far too good to miss. I mean, we know that that has to be important. It's very rare and it must be suggestive. But he didn't like Mama, avoided all mention of her when possible, didn't give a damn when she died. Can't think of anyone else except Gore Vidal who could say that. Quite respected his father, clearly, was very lucky. For him, his life begins with his education, which is very good because he is a man of the Enlightenment and of great learning and he's one of nature's bibliophiles as well. So, and he's lucky with his teachers, very lucky with his teachers in Virginia. But I think wanted to be private. And we know that his first date was a nightmare with Miss Rebecca Burwell, the most sought after babe of the town in those days. And he worked out a very carefully, probably much too carefully rehearsed approach to her at a dance and was made to look and feel, I think, a complete idiot, and wrote an agonized letter to a friend the next day about this and started to get his migraine attacks at that point, which never left him. We've all been there.
I'm going to ask my last question to allow the audience their chance, and that's going to be maybe an inevitable question. It's the mix of lives that a biography represents that I want to get at, because how much you are aware that it is Corda on Grant, or how much Corda withdraws either in the voice you use or in the aspiration toward objectivity that you planned. So I'd like each of you to just give some sense of whether you're consciously holding yourself back or enjoying what may in fact be an essay by you on this life, and so you're part of it.
Well, you can't, even if you tried very hard, you cannot remove yourself. The notion of a totally objective biography is almost impossible to achieve and probably not worth achieving, because you could do that essentially by putting together just the salient facts of a life in the form of a list. The Encyclopedia Britannica provides pretty good objective biographies of almost anybody you can think of, and they're quite concise. But if you're going to write somebody's life and really write it, you must bring to the table, whether you like them or not, your own feelings about that person, about the world they lived in, about yourself. You cannot avoid seeing them through your eyes.
But what about your voice? Is it there?
Well, your voice, of course, has to be there, because if you're a writer, your voice is what is the essential thing that you have. It also, and it's one argument, another strong argument against plagiarism, as if there were not already enough, is that over the length of a book, it would be enormously tedious to try and write about anything in a voice or with a range of interests that were not your own. And so to attempt to do it that way would be almost undoable, I think, for most writers. But above all, I think the important thing is not to be completely objective, because you can't pretend to be that, but to be completely open to the reality that's presented to you on a page. And you can't turn away from the worst in your character, your central figure. You mustn't exalt over the best. You must try and present as nearly as you can the person as you think that person was. Now, that's a difficult task and a challenge, and it's probably not possible for any biographer, even the most gifted one, to succeed in doing that 100%. But that's what you really have to do. You have to read each page and say, if Grant himself were reading this page, would he agree with it? Would he disagree with it? Would he think it was fair? Would he think it was unfair? And those are questions which ought to keep a biographer awake at night.
To what extent is your book a collaboration of two lives, Francine?
Well, I think for one thing, it's always a great idea to have artists write about other artists. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are things that Caravaggio experienced and faced in the world that I felt extremely sympathetic toward. I also felt, just for me, that I was able to use the various disparate and often sort of schizophrenic parts of my life as a writer in the book. I mean, that is, you know, my long career as a novelist, my briefer career as an art critic, and also, you know, insofar as I write what I guess is called cultural criticism, I feel that you know, it's the kind of voice crying out in the wilderness against things that are trashy and false and sentimental and hollow, which was certainly what Caravaggio was doing every moment.
Christopher.
It's not unlike the question you asked before, what has an echo of it, about sympathy for one's subject. I just voyaged back to Oxford to attend the retirement dinner of my old history tutor, Brian Harrison, who actually, so far from retiring, has just given up his college position to produce the general edition of the Dictionary of National Biography, which I believe some of you can already get online. I mean, it's about to be anyway, and is, by all accounts, an epic achievement of its kind. An extraordinary thing. The DNB hasn't been redone for some time, and Brian's really done it. Every account I hear of it is very praising. I mention this because his practice has been, as I think the DNB's was for some time, if you want to get people who can really write about it convincingly for others, they probably should have some sympathy for, as well as some knowledge of, the subject. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all these wonderful portraits of old deans and bishops and figures of the Church of England that are one of the delights of the DNB. And, for example, there's an 8,500 word entry on Karl Marx in this new edition. And it's by Eric Hobsbawm, who has been a communist most of his life. I would say I wouldn't quarrel with that, because there actually isn't anyone who knows the subject better than Hobsbawm. At least if there is, I can't think who it would have been, who could possibly have been given that job. But since everyone knows who he is, and since everyone knows, as it were, where his heart and sleeve come into apposition, I think there's no harm in that at all. Again, my own case, I claim, is different, because there are only about 3 presidential studies I think you could write that mean you have to write about the United States, without whom there wouldn't be a United States. There's obviously Washington, clearly Jefferson, certainly Lincoln, and probably Roosevelt. It's possible to imagine there not being the United States as we understand it to be. So that's a lot to ask. And one of the reasons I was so grateful to James, and so humble, a word I was trying to avoid using, or being, for this, was that it happened to coincide with my own decision to take out the papers of citizenship as an American. I decided sometime after September the 11th of 2001 that I would be cheating the country of its dues in a way if I just went on being a green card holder. I wanted to make it plain that I had signed on. And so it was in that frame of mind that I wrote about Jefferson. I don't think it made me any more lenient about any of his shortcomings or crimes. It was said by some historian, now forgotten, that this is about a century ago now, I think, that if Jefferson was right, the United States is right. If Jefferson was wrong, the United States is wrong. Too simple, but worth cogitating.
I'm glad you made your decision earlier than Henry James did about Britain. There's an odd parallel.
Well, I make my students do this about Eliot very nearly succeeding in becoming an Englishman, and Auden succeeding more or less in becoming a New Yorker at least.
Right.
So which culture got the best of the bargain? It's a good essay I make them do. With Henry James, unfortunately, there's no question which country got the best of the bargain.
Now, I'd like to give the audience a chance at questions. We have about 15 minutes for that if you are interested in asking this elegant crew something. No? Oh, yes, please. Would you stand up and as loudly as you can?
Mr. Korda, I'm curious if you saw any affinity between Grant and Huck Finn.
You have to speak up.
Yes.
Any affinity, whether you saw any affinity between Grant and Huck Finn.
On Huck Finn, yes. That's an interesting question, actually. But it relates to the question which we discussed of going back to the era in which the person lived with some sense of sympathy and understanding for that period. It's not accidental that Mark Twain ended up being Grant's publisher. And it's not accidental that American literature, to some degree, rests upon Grant's extraordinary brevity and lapidary ability to write concise English. His memoirs are an amazingly readable, an amazingly well-written book, but are a lesson in how to write brief, short sentences from which Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and any number of American writers who grew up in the heartland derived their style. You can read Grant's memoirs and see quite quickly how anybody reading them would be led towards a particularly abrupt and compressed style of writing. In addition to which, of course, growing up in Ohio and Illinois in the 1820s, the 1830s, next to a great river, because he was born on the Ohio River, Grant had what looks superficially like a Huck Finn childhood. On the other hand, when you read about his father, Jesse Grant, who was surely one of the most overbearing, overambitious, and bumptious people ever to have fathered a child, and his extraordinary
just think of the
reclusive mother.
competition for
Yeah,
that.
I know. There's a huge competition for it. But in any such competition, trust me, Jesse
would win.
Grant would get a strong number of votes. You realize that it's a deceptive Huck Finn childhood. It's barefooted and fishing with a bear hook in the Ohio River and growing up in the circumstances of Huck Finn, but growing up also under a shadow of expectations he couldn't fulfill and awkwardness which were to dog Grant all his life. But yeah, Grant's childhood looks on the surface a lot like Huck Finn's.
Interesting question. Yes, please. And would you stand? Thank you. Yes.
Ms. Prose, I've read the Muses, the book about the Muses, and I'd like you to, if you would, talk about how you approached those biographies, albeit brief. And then I'd like to ask your publisher which women he is doing. We've only heard about men.
I think the first question was to Francine about the Muses and how that might relate, and then we'll get to the second.
Well, they were shorter. The essays were shorter for certain. And also, I was thinking about them in relation to one another. So in other words, my choice of which women to put in the book depended a lot on which other women I had and what sort of stories I was telling. I mean, I just knew that I wanted 9 stories as different from one another as I possibly could. I mean, Caravaggio, you know, it was just me and Caravaggio. So it was a very different situation. And, you know, it depended. I mean, the 9 women in the book, some of them I felt extremely sympathetic toward, and some of them quite a bit less so. Caravaggio, it was pure sympathy.
And the second part of the question was really to James Atlas, and that was, is it a mere coincidence that all of these lives are lives of men, or is in fact, are there a number of lives of women I think that's essentially what you were asking in the series. And James, would you mind giving this awesome responsibility to stand so everybody can face?
I'm really in the spotlight here. It's certainly an issue, and we may have fallen short in our multicultural and multi-gender, bi-gender responsibilities. And in my previous series, we had Simone Day, like Francine Gray, and we had...
You can go to the podium if you like.
I beg your pardon. I don't want to go back up here. Anyway, and we had Joan of Arc by Mary Gordon, and we had Catherine Harrison on St. Teresa of Lisieux. However, I confess that we have... Microphone.
I think it's...
I confess that we have... Now you've gotten me up here again. I confess that we have had a problem in this area, very little of which can be attributed to my being a male chauvinist. If you look at history, and if you look at the history of literature, if you look at great generals, great religious figures, unfortunately, men rule. Now, that may change. I assume it's going to change. But anyone who has suggestions, come up and see me after the show.
Remember, we almost had a life of Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, we did. But I got to say, Jefferson's preferable.
Okay, well, fairly asked, fairly answered. Another question? Oh, yes, thanks. Again, would you stand up and boom out if you can?
I have no trouble booming. This probably is a variation of the last question you asked, but it's a question about imagination. When you write history, of course, you have to have a certain amount of imagination, but are you aware, do you have some sort of internal monitor that tells you at a certain point when you're lapsing into the area of speculation? Francine, you're a novelist, that must be an irresistible temptation, especially when you don't have many source materials to work with. Christopher, just the opposite, because you have so much to work with. That is there a danger that you reach a point where you know that you're only speculating, you've left your subject behind, and is there something in you that says, that's the point beyond which I can't go?
I would just summarize that as basically the question of the temptation of over-speculation, maybe the investment of yourself in this without sufficient evidence, and are you aware and worried about that? Michael?
Well, you mentioned before David McCullough, and having been his editor and publisher for a very long time, David once told me, and I think it's absolutely true, that the words a biographer must shy away from, as if they were totally evil, are he must have felt. So that when you read a biography of Napoleon that says, as he crossed the Niemen River, Napoleon must have felt, you should put the book down and move on to another book. At any rate, you should begin to approach the book with great, great caution. We know what people did. We know what they said. We know what they wrote. We do not know how they must have felt. And therefore, and all of those biographies of Napoleon, in which there's at least as much fact available as on Thomas Jefferson, if not more, are nevertheless, they will inevitably bring you to what must he have felt as he stepped upon the decks of the Bellerophon. Well, we don't know what he felt when he stepped upon the decks of the Bellerophon, and therefore, as biographers, we have to be very careful whenever we find ourselves typing those particular words to ask, do we in fact know? And if we don't, take them out.
Anyone else on the temptations of speculation?
I would just add the phrase, would have thought.
Yes.
To must have felt.
Yes.
No, I would say must have felt, it must be in there somewhere, and I'll tell you why. When I said earlier that I can't believe there's ever been an argument about Sally Hemings, I mean that you can make it come out differently. You can have Jefferson alone in Paris, a widower, and you can have him ask for one servant to be sent with his daughter and get another one he didn't know was coming, who's just turned 15 and is his wife's half-sister and looks like him, like her. And you can read the letters that he writes to other women that contain dick jokes, penis jokes taken from Lawrence Stern and so on. And you can look at all that and think, well, I bet he never laid a glove on her, if you like. If you don't make the assumption, that some people don't, that he was some kind of I think it's cherubim and seraphim that are forbidden to have genitalia, even in their mythological appearance. Well, if you don't think he did, then you don't know what he must have felt. But if you do think he did, then you do know what he must have felt.
If that isn't a full response.
He must have looked at her and thought, all my birthdays have just arrived in Paris at once. That's what he must have thought. I can be confident of it. It would be nice to have a picture of her, I must say. It would be really, really good to have even a painting, even. We don't have a thing, but we have some very good descriptions. He must have felt wow.
We have time for one question more. That may have neatly summed it up. Okay. Oh, yes, please. And again, stand. Just to repeat the question, have you considered writing about a person who, or have you done, a person who is still living?
I have written about people who are still living, yes. And it's a lot easier to write about people who are dead. I wrote about my aunt, Merlot Brown, while she was still alive, and had cause to deeply regret having done so. I think it's terrific to write about people who are still living, but it's very difficult to write about them with total honesty. And the one thing to be said for biography is there are an awful lot of interesting dead people to write about. You'd have to be willing to take very serious risks indeed if you were to write honestly about living people.
In the Muses book, there's a chapter on Yoko Ono and another one on Suzanne Farrell. And I spent a lot of time on the phone with the HarperCollins lawyers. Almost as much time on talking to the lawyers as I did writing the chapters. So that was a cautionary experience for me.
And you weren't related to them.
No.
The lawyers too, I've written, it would be a very kind friend of mine who would call either of these Stracheian, but they were intended as polemical revisions of existing reputations. One case of William Jefferson Clinton, and in the other case of actually a client of Mr. Core's, Henry Kissinger. And the purpose of the two books was in the first case to try and shorten the political career, and in the second case, if possible, to try and shorten the life.
Okay.
Didn't work, unfortunately.
Indeed, Jane.
Didn't succeed in abbreviating either, I have to say.
Since I spent 11 years writing a biography of Saul Bellow, who's still alive,
Yes.
don't do it.
Well, I think on that note, wonderful that you had the last word. Let's thank both our panelists and our shadow panelists.
The biographies of Thomas Jefferson, Caravaggio, and Ulysses S. Grant are all part of the HarperCollins Imminent Live series. For more information, visit harpercollins.com.